Hermeneutics, the art and science of interpreting the Bible. My name is Monique Thomas.
And I am Stacy Johnson.
Today we will be teaching you the process of biblical hermeneutics. The principles and processes that we will be using is based on vernacular and AU. At the end of this lesson, you should be able to describe what is hermeneutics, determine why is it necessary, and understand and apply the hermeneutical process. What is hermeneutics? Hermeneutics is a science and art of biblical interpretation. Why is it a science and an art? It is a science because it has rules that can be classified in an orderly system. It is an art because communication is flexible.
Why is it necessary? It is necessary because there are barriers that affect our spontaneous understanding of Scripture. For instance, the historical gap. Biblical events and the writing of these events were many centuries ago. The time span separating the original writer and the contemporary readers creates a historical gap, which makes it difficult for spontaneous understanding of the meaning the author intended to convey. Another gap is the cultural gap. Cultures change over time and may also differ among different groups of people. So there are significant differences between our culture and the culture of the ancient Hebrew. In our attempt to spontaneously interpret the Bible, biblical practices, the foreign cultures of the Bible, pose challenges for proper biblical interpretation. Additionally, there are the philosophical gap. With the different cultures comes different views of life. The contemporary readers may have different worldviews. Failure to understand the general beliefs, values, attitudes of the biblical writers and their original audience can hinder proper interpretation. There's also the linguistic gap. The Bible was originally written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, which have different structures and idioms from each other, as well as from our own language. Unfamiliarity with the different idioms may result in the distortion of meaning from that intended by the original writer. Our presuppositions can also affect how we interpret Scripture. Our views on inspiration, whether we view the Bible as fully inspired by God, partially inspired, or not inspired at all, will definitely affect how we interpret Scripture. Also, inerrancy, whether we believe in full inerrancy or limited inerrancy. Full inerrancy, basically, that the original manuscripts of Scripture are totally without error, or limited inerrancy, that Scripture is without error in matters of faith and practice, but there may be errors as it refers to historical, geographical, or scientific matters. Our views on whether Scripture is to be understood as literal, figurative, or symbolic can also affect how we interpret Scripture, as well as double authorship and sensu pleno. Double authorship basically is the belief that God and man work together to produce the inspired Scriptures, while sensu pleno is the view that Scripture has a fuller sense than that intended by the author. All of these stand as barriers or hindrances to our understanding of Scripture and can have an impact or effect upon how we interpret Scripture. The hermeneutical process is geared towards bridging these gaps. At this point, we will look at the hermeneutical process, which involves 7 steps. The first step is the historical and cultural analysis. Second, the contextual analysis. The third step is the lexical syntactical analysis. Step 4, the theological analysis. Step 5, literary analysis. The sixth step is to compare the analysis with other interpreters. And step 7, to now make an application. As we go through this process, we will be using James chapter 1 verse 2 to 8 to illustrate.
And it reads, My brethren, count it all joy when ye fall into divers temptation, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. But let patience have her perfect work, that ye may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that giveth to all men liberally, and upbraideth it not, and it shall be given him. But let him ask in faith, nothing wavering. For he that wavereth is like a wave of the sea, driven with the wind and tossed. For let not that man think that he shall receive anything of the Lord. A double-minded man is unstable in all his ways.
Step 1. Do a historical and cultural analysis. You must determine the general historical circumstances. What were the general historical circumstances facing the writer or the audience at that time? For instance, in the book of James, were there any social, economical, political circumstances? Were there any threats or concerns facing the author or the audience? If we look at the book of James, we would realize that the Jewish believers were facing manifold trials. The poor suffered at the hands of the rich Jewish employers. They suffered social injustices. The wealthy employers took them before the courts or withheld their wages. The next thing is, what customs or cultural practices influence the actions of the writer or audience? We will also look at what was the spiritual conditions of the audience. Now, under these persecution, the Jewish believers had a worldly attitude. The believers were showing partiality towards the rich. There was strife among them. They had no control over their tongue. So they had the wrong attitude in the midst of persecution. We will also need to know who was the writer and what was his spiritual background and experience. Who were the recipients? What was or were his purpose for writing? Was it implicitly stated or explicitly stated? For instance, the purpose is not explicitly stated in the book of James, but from the content of the book, it is evident that James is writing to encourage the Jewish believers to demonstrate a faith that works. Step 2. Do a contextual analysis. Your aim will be to determine how the passage under consideration fits into its immediate context, or to get an understanding of the immediate context. You will need to know what are the major blocks of material and how they fit together. You will need to outline the book by identifying ideas or units of thoughts that go together. It may be helpful to remove all the text numbers and paragraphs and to try to formulate your own outline. Try to see how the author's thoughts flow. You may want to pay attention to connecting words such as and, therefore, wherefore, and any other word that may indicate the start of a new thought or a continuation of the preceding thought. You want to determine how does the text, in this case James 1, 2 to 8, fit into the author's flow of thought or fit into the author's argument. Also, what is the perspective the author intended to communicate? Is it from a human perspective or is it from God's perspective? Is the passage stating descriptive or prescriptive truth? For instance, is the passage telling an event as it is, or is it prescribing a particular action? that should be followed by the believers. If we look at our text, James is prescribing how they should behave in the midst of persecution. He is saying, count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptation. What is the teaching focus of the passage? What are just incidental details? We must determine this. Who is this particular passage directed to? In this case, James directs his writing to the Jewish believers. Step 3. Do a lexical and syntactical analysis. You must determine the specific meaning the author intended words to convey. For instance, words can carry multiple meanings. In our culture, we use the word hot. Hot can mean temperature that can burn you, or it can mean you're looking hot, as in sexy. So, the idea is to choose the word that best fits into the context of our passage. In order to do this, we must do a word study. We must also analyze how these words are arranged and how they relate to each other. This is doing a syntactical analysis. We must then summarize the results into easily understood language. So how do you do a word study? First, you choose significant words or phrases in your passage. For instance, words that are repeated, difficult words, figures of speech. If we look at James 1:2-8, the words patience and perfect are repeated and they are also difficult words. So we would look at those words. Next, you compare the Hebrew or Greek with English translation. The Greek word hupomone can carry a number of meanings. It can mean perseverance, endurance, or patience. We have to now determine which of these words best fit into the context. For instance, in the book of James, in chapter 1:2-8, it's talking about persecution. So in light of the persecution that the audience was facing, the word perseverance or endurance would better fit that context than patience. Additionally, we can also evaluate how the words are used in the Old and New Testament. However, we must remember that context must always determine meaning. There are a number of tools that can be used to help us in our word study. We can use concordances, exegetical dictionaries, Bible software, lexicons, commentaries, and even interlinear Bibles. Step 4. Do a theological analysis. Theological analysis is concerned with answering the question, how does this passage fit into the total pattern of God's revelation?
We also want to determine what is your view on God's revelation to man. So is there continuity in Scripture or discontinuity in Scripture? We also want to look at or understand and identify the implication of your view or presupposition to the text. So if you believe that God's revelation to man there's a continuous flow, for instance, let's look at God's redemptive plan. Did God's redemptive plan begin in the New Testament or it begin in the Old and flow to the New? Now, for a person who don't believe that there's a continuity in God's redemptive plan, they don't see the Old Testament as relevant, or they don't see the entire scripture as relevant. So we could understand where our presupposition could affect not only how we view scripture, but how we interpret scripture. We also want to look at how to evaluate the extent of the theological knowledge available to the people at the time. So what theological knowledge was available to the people at the time? That's important. We also will look at, in light of the theological knowledge of the audience, we want to determine the meaning the passage had to them. And lastly, we want to identify additional knowledge on the topic in light of God's entire revelation. So, for instance, what other scripture outside of James shed light on the attitude of the believer in the midst of temptation? Step 4. Literary analysis. Identify the literary form and apply the appropriate analysis. Look for any explicit references that will indicate the type of literature. And if the literary form is not explicitly identified, study the characteristic of the passage deductively to determine the literary form. So for instance, the book of James has some characteristic of an epistle. It opens with a typical salutation and flows into the main argument or body. We also want to apply the principle of literary devices carefully to your passage. So metaphor, simile, and proverb look for a single point of comparison. So when we look at James 1:6, we see a simile, and we see the faithless or doubtful man is being compared to the wave that is tossed to and fro by the wind. We also want to look to see if there's any parable that's within our text. Now, a parable have one central teaching or significant detail. We also want to look at if there's any allegories to identify the multiple points of comparison intended by the author.
With prophecy or apocalyptic writing, the first thing you want to do is observe the style of writing. Like the other types of literature, you approach prophetic and apocalyptic literature by doing the same historical, cultural, contextual, lexical, syntactical, and theological analysis. However, in your literary analysis, you must be aware that figurative or symbolic language is usually used. And also, when you're doing the lexical aspect of your analysis, you must be aware as well that words may be interpreted symbolically or figuratively. Next thing you want to do is look for supernatural elements. Any information or message given through any supernatural means, whether it be through angels or in a vision, this would help you to understand, the meaning. Look for any, you want to also look for any underlying action of the unseen world behind that of the visible world. So you're going to trace that action until the conclusion, which is often the conclusion of the sovereign God. Tracing that action is going to give you a better understanding of the meaning the author is trying to convey. You also want to determine whether the passage is part of a progressive prediction or falls within the category of developmental fulfillment or prophetic telescoping. So what do I mean by these terms? Progressive prediction basically means that although a prophetic passage has one set time of fulfillment, there may be a number of other passages throughout Scripture which also reveal a pattern of the chronological process in the fulfillment of that prophecy. In other words, one passage may only be a part of the whole as it relates to a particular event. Developmental fulfillment, basically a prophecy that has several progressive stages leading up to its total fulfillment. While prophetic telescoping, often one prophecy stretches across many distinct periods of time, seem to pertain only to one time period or one event, but may be speaking of multiple events. For instance, there are passages in the Bible which speak of two comings of Christ as if they were one. Step 6 is to compare your analysis with other interpreters. At this stage, you would have arrived at a meaning. So, you want to state the meaning that you derived from your passage in simple, easily understood words. Next, you must compare your analysis with other scholarly work. So, you will want to look at commentaries, especially those single-volume exegetical commentaries. Once you compare your meaning with other scholarly works, and you find that your interpretation is far off, in other words, no other biblical scholar have interpreted it as you have, you may want to review your interpretation. The possibility is that your interpretation is incorrect. So, you may want to make adjustments to your interpretation if it is needed. Once you have arrived at the meaning of your passage, the final step is applying the biblical message. A text will only have one meaning, the author's intended meaning, but may have many applications. Principalizing is a method of application. Principalizing is seeking to discover the spiritual, moral, and theological principles within your passage that are relevant for believers today. So in principalizing, you will need to determine the principle or principles that the passage intended to teach. You will also need to determine the principles that are still relevant for today. Let's look at some guidelines for principalizing. Principles must be derived from a careful historical, cultural, contextual, lexical, syntactical, and theological analysis. Theologically, the meaning and principle derived from the text must be consistent with the overall teaching of Scripture. So, the meaning you derive from the passage must not contradict teachings in other places of the Bible. But must be consistent with the teaching in the rest of the Bible. Determine if the principles are intended to teach or are simply describing a truth or an event as it is. Principles can be nominative or non-normative. In other words, it can be a set standard, the way things always happens, or it could be non-nominative, not necessarily a set standard, or the way something always happens, there are variations. Let's refer to our text, James 1, chapter 1, verse 2 to 8. The message derived is that the believers will face trials, but must have the right attitude, a joyful attitude in the midst of trials, since trials are used as an instrument to test their faith, produce endurance, and bring believers to maturity. If we have to pull some principles from that, and we can see that the passage is talking about value of trials as well, we can say God uses trials to produce endurance, which brings believers to maturity. Now, what we want to do now that we have pulled out a principle, we want to see if the meaning and the principles is consistent with the overall teaching of Scripture. So, we can see in 1 Peter 1, 6 to 9, it talks about rejoicing in trials. 1 Peter 4, 12 to 13 also talks about rejoicing because of the value of trials. So here we see that the teaching itself is consistent with the rest of Scripture. We also realize that the principles derived from the text is intended to teach. It doesn't just describe an event or a truth, but it's actually intended to teach. and they are set principles in that it always happens in that manner. Another aspect of applying the biblical message is the transcultural transmission of biblical commands, or in other words, translating biblical commands from one culture to another. The first thing one must do is accurately understand the principle behind the command. Then you must determine whether the principles are transcultural or culture. In other words, whether those principles are timeless and can be transferred from one culture to the other, or applicable from one culture to the other, or whether they are bound by the culture of that particular time and so cannot be applied within another time and culture. If a principle is accepted as transcultural, then the exegetes must further determine whether the same behavioral expression in our culture will express the principle as adequately and accurately as the biblical one. For instance, if we look at James 1, the biblical command to rejoice in the midst of trials, it is not bound by any culture of that time, but it is a timeless command and so can be applied to our time. However, if we look at John 13:12-17, that command to the disciples to wash each other's feet, while the principle itself, that of humility, goes beyond time and can be used in our culture and time, the behavioral expression may not be appropriate or may not adequately and accurately express or give meaning to us in our time, give the meaning of humility rather. If the behavioral expression of a principle should be changed, a suggested equivalent cultural expression of that principle should be employed. So in the case of washing of each other's feet, the principle itself remains, that is the principle of humility. However, the behavioral command may have to be changed to a cultural expression that may be, in our time, that may be equivalent to that one. On the other hand, if after many studies there is still uncertainty, apply the biblical precept of humility. Let's look at some guidelines to determine whether principles and commands are culture-bound or transcultural. First, you must examine the reason for the principle given. If the reason for a principle is bound by the culture, then the principle may be as well. If the reason for the principle is based on God's unchanging nature, such as His love, His holiness, then the principle should probably not be changed. Likewise, a command grounded in God's moral law, such as abstaining from fornication or idolatry, or the command to love one another, must be seen as applicable for believers today or transcultural. In determining if a command is transcultural, it is also important to determine the intended recipients. Was the command given to one person? Was the command given to only one church? This may help us to determine if the command was meant to be universal and so timeless. We have now come to the end of our lesson, but remember, context, context, context. Context is crucial to biblical exegesis. So as you apply the principles of biblical hermeneutics, always consider the context.